When someone hurts you and walks away as if nothing ever happened, it leaves behind a confusion deeper than the pain itself. You begin to question your worth, your perception, your memory. But what if the answer lies not in your fragility, but in their inner fragmentation? Many people live disconnected from themselves. They move through life blind to their emotional wounds, acting out their pain without knowing it. When they hurt you, they may not be fully conscious of the damage they've caused. Not because it didn't happen, but because acknowledging it would force them to face a part of themselves they've been avoiding for years. It is easier to pretend it never happened than to deal with the guilt that comes from truly seeing it. The one who hurt you may carry within them unresolved childhood wounds, buried fears, or silent shame. When those emotions rise, they seek an outlet. And if you stand too close, you become the canvas for their projection. You receive the blame, the insult, the betrayal, not because of who you are, but because of what they refuse to confront within themselves. In psychology, we call this projection of the shadow. The shadow is not something evil. It is simply the part of the self that has been denied: anger, insecurity, jealousy, grief. When a person hasn't integrated these parts, they leak out in harmful ways. They hurt others and cannot even recognize themselves as the aggressor. This is why they walk away guiltless, because to admit their fault would be to admit their hidden self exists. But the most difficult truth to digest is this: some people are not emotionally equipped to face their own behavior. They lack the inner tools for reflection, not because they are necessarily malicious, but because they are undeveloped. They were never taught to self-reflect, to take accountability, to process shame in a healthy way. And so, they simply suppress the incident, mask it with indifference, and move on, leaving you frozen in confusion. In the face of this emotional abandonment, the most important thing you can do is not demand an apology that will never come, but to understand the mechanism behind their silence. This is not permission for them to keep hurting you. It is liberation for you to stop tying your healing to their awareness. The emotionally unaware live in a dream. They hurt and forget. You, however, are awakening. And that awakening is painful because you begin to see what others cannot even bear to glance at. But with that pain comes strength, because once you understand their behavior, it no longer controls you. You do not need closure from those who are closed within themselves. You do not need justice from those who cannot yet be just with their own soul. You need understanding. Because when you see that their behavior was not about you, but about their own fragmented inner world, you free yourself from the illusion that you were never enough. It begins with repression, not necessarily a deliberate act, but a survival instinct formed early in life. A child who was never taught how to process pain, who was punished for showing anger or ignored when crying, learns to push those emotions down. The unprocessed sorrow turns inward. Over time, it crystallizes into a distorted sense of normal. That same child grows up into an adult who thinks they've moved on, when in truth, they've only buried everything beneath distraction, pride, and performance. When this person enters relationships, whether friendships or romantic connections, they carry an invisible emotional history. But because they've never learned how to feel deeply without fear, they become numb to the emotional consequences of their actions. When they hurt someone, they may not even realize the depth of their impact. And if they do sense it, they quickly sweep it under the rug, because admitting it would threaten the false self they've built to survive. This is not always an act of cruelty. It is often an act of unconscious protection. Self-deception becomes their daily armor. They tell themselves things like, "I didn't mean it," "They're too sensitive," "It wasn't that serious." These statements are not always lies intended for others. They are lies intended for themselves. Because to admit "I caused pain" would require them to feel the pain they've long avoided. It would require empathy, and empathy requires access to one's own emotional pain first. If you've spent your life repressing that pain, then empathy becomes impossible, because you cannot feel what you've never allowed yourself to feel. In this way, repression fuels a cycle. They hurt you, but since they cannot tolerate the discomfort of guilt or shame, they repress it. That repression then turns into forgetfulness or detachment or even justification. And so, they continue life as if nothing happened, not out of malice, but out of emotional dysfunction. You are left carrying the wound, while they carry the illusion of innocence. But the danger of emotional repression is that it doesn't just affect them. It spreads, it invalidates others, it gaslights without needing words. You start questioning if you were truly hurt. You start wondering if you overreacted. And slowly, their repression becomes your self-doubt. That is the silent violence of emotional neglect. It makes you feel like the problem for feeling anything at all. This repression, left unchecked, sets the foundation for projection. Because what is pushed down does not disappear, it seeks release. And when they can no longer hold it within, they unconsciously push it onto others. You become the scapegoat for their hidden emotions. You become the mirror that reflects what they are desperate not to see. And when the mirror reveals too much, they look away, not to protect you, but to protect the illusion that they are whole, stable, and in control. Once repression has taken hold, the next stage unfolds in projection. What we repress does not disappear, it waits. It lives in the dark, unacknowledged corners of the psyche, silently shaping behavior. The person who cannot admit they are angry, insecure, jealous, or hurt begins to see these qualities everywhere, but never within themselves. Instead, they project them outward onto others, unconsciously turning their relationships into battlegrounds of unresolved emotion. They hurt you, but in their inner narrative, it becomes your fault. If you confront them, they accuse you of being too sensitive, dramatic, or aggressive. If you withdraw, they label you distant, cold, or disloyal. What you are experiencing is not truly about you. It's about the parts of themselves they are unwilling to meet. You have become the mirror, and that mirror makes them uncomfortable. So, rather than face the reflection, they shatter the mirror. Projection is not just a psychological phenomenon, it's a survival mechanism. To face the shadow self would require more strength and honesty than many are prepared for. The shadow contains shame, guilt, envy, weakness, abandonment, and rage. These are the parts they were taught to fear or suppress, so they build a persona, an image of who they think they should be, and to maintain that image, they must exile anything that doesn't fit it. The exile becomes the shadow, and the shadow must be denied. But the psyche does not tolerate fragmentation forever. What is denied eventually demands expression, and because direct expression is too threatening, the unconscious mind finds a substitute, another person. You, in their perception, you become the one who is flawed, untrustworthy, cruel, or weak, because that is easier than admitting those qualities exist in them. They offload their internal chaos onto you, and then step back as if untouched. This is why they can hurt you and act like nothing happened. In their version of reality, you were the trigger, you were the problem. They are simply reacting, defending, surviving. They are blind to the possibility that they are the source of harm, because the shadow they've disowned is now living outside of them, projected onto someone else. This kind of projection is not exclusive to cruel people. It's common in emotionally immature or psychologically unaware individuals. They do not see their actions as harmful because they are too invested in maintaining the false self, the image that says, "I am good, I am right, I am justified." To protect that image, they must cast you into the role of the villain, and so, without realizing it, they wound you, and then blame you for bleeding. This pattern continues until awareness breaks the cycle. But awareness requires courage, and courage requires stillness. It requires the individual to stop blaming others and start investigating their own inner world. Until that happens, they will continue to hurt, project, and abandon, because facing the shadow feels more unbearable than the damage caused by ignoring it. The deeper root behind projection is not just repression. It is a lack of emotional maturity. Emotional maturity is not about age, intelligence, or external success. It is about the capacity to recognize, regulate, and take responsibility for one's inner world. But when someone hasn't developed this capacity, they move through relationships reactively, not reflectively. They do not understand their emotions, they become possessed by them. The person who hurt you and pretended nothing happened likely did not do so because they are strong. On the contrary, they are emotionally fragile. They cannot sit with guilt because guilt would threaten the image they have of themselves. They cannot say, "I was wrong," because that requires the strength to admit imperfection without collapsing. They have never cultivated the self-awareness needed to track their own emotional patterns. So when they cause pain, they either don't notice, or they quickly justify, deny, or deflect. Projection, as discussed earlier, is often their first line of defense. But even projection stems from this lack of internal observation. They do not pause to ask, "Why did I react this way?" or "What part of me is triggered?" because to pause is to confront, and confrontation with the self is something they have never been taught to survive. Self-awareness demands a certain kind of silence, the kind that makes space to feel discomfort without escaping it. It is in this space that maturity begins. But when someone lacks this inner stillness, their entire emotional system is outsourced to the world around them. They blame, they criticize, they lash out, not because they are inherently cruel, but because they have no other language for their pain. This absence of emotional literacy also makes them poor communicators in conflict. Instead of speaking with vulnerability, they either shut down or explode. Instead of asking how you feel, they make assumptions. Instead of saying, "I didn't mean to hurt you," they say, "Why are you overreacting?" And instead of accountability, they offer silence, as if ignoring the wound will make it disappear. They have confused avoidance with strength, but true strength lies in acknowledgement. It takes far more courage to admit, "I hurt someone and I don't know why," than to act like the harm never occurred. But emotional maturity is not rewarded in a world that praises image over depth, pride over humility, and quick escape over honest repair. You may find yourself stuck in cycles with these individuals, hoping for closure, an apology, or some kind of recognition. But if they are not self-aware, they cannot give you what they do not give themselves. They cannot meet your emotional reality when they have yet to meet their own. When emotional maturity is absent, the ego steps in to protect the fragile self. It becomes a shield, not just against guilt, but against exposure. In social environments, especially where appearances matter more than depth, the ego learns how to adapt, disguise, and distort. People who hurt you and act like nothing happened are often driven by a deep need to preserve the mask they wear in front of others. Not only are they disconnected from their emotional reality, they are terrified of being seen as flawed. To maintain this mask, the ego employs a range of defense mechanisms. Denial is the most common. The incident didn't happen, or if it did, it wasn't serious, or if it was serious, it was your fault. Denial helps them survive the cognitive dissonance between "I am a good person" and "I hurt someone." To protect their self-image, they twist the narrative until their role seems harmless or justified. Then comes rationalization. They'll tell themselves, "I had no choice," or "they deserved it," or "anyone would have done the same." These are not conscious lies. They are subtle psychological distortions that help them sleep at night. They reframe the situation to escape responsibility. You are left with the wreckage, while they walk away with a clean conscience, wrapped in their own justifications. In public or shared environments, the pressure to maintain a likable persona amplifies these mechanisms. They may present themselves as kind, peaceful, even spiritual. And if you attempt to reveal the harm they've caused, you risk becoming the one who stirs drama, can't let go, or brings negativity. This social dynamic further incentivizes them to pretend nothing happened. Admitting fault would threaten their social standing, and in a world that rewards image, perception often outweighs truth. Avoidance is another key mechanism. Some individuals don't argue or deny. They simply vanish. They ghost you emotionally, physically, or psychologically. Why? Because facing you would mean facing themselves. And when the ego is fragile, confrontation feels like death. So they disappear, hoping time will erase the evidence, or that your silence will signal forgiveness. But what this reveals is a deeper truth. Their behavior is not about you. It is about the self they are desperately trying to protect. The childlike self that cannot tolerate shame. The brittle identity that cannot absorb accountability. The ego does not care about truth. It only cares about survival. And to the ego, admitting harm is equivalent to losing power, status, or control. The tragedy is that, in trying to protect themselves, they abandon others. Their defense mechanisms may preserve their pride, but they destroy connection. The relationship, the trust, the safety, all are sacrificed at the altar of self-preservation. And you, the one who was hurt, are expected to quietly accept their silence, just so they can maintain the illusion that they are untouched, blameless, and composed. When someone hurts you and then pretends it never happened, your first instinct may be to seek justice, to expose them, to make them feel the pain they caused, to force them into acknowledgement. But this response, though human, can easily entangle you in the very dysfunction you are trying to escape. Because if they are too unconscious, too emotionally immature, too ego-protected to own their behavior, your retaliation will not awaken them. It will only deepen your own suffering. Understanding becomes the only doorway to healing. Not understanding in the shallow sense of excusing them, but in the deeper psychological sense of seeing through them. When you grasp the roots of their behavior, the repression, the shadow projection, the emotional immaturity, the ego defense, you stop taking their actions personally. You stop carrying the narrative that you were unworthy of honesty, care, or accountability. You realize it wasn't that you didn't matter. It was that they never learned how to deal with their own reflection. This shift in awareness is what liberates you from emotional dependence on their closure. You no longer need the apology to move forward. You no longer crave their validation to feel seen. You begin to differentiate between someone's behavior and your value. And that is a mark of inner growth, when your peace no longer depends on someone else's awareness. But this kind of understanding requires stillness. It requires space where the ego softens and clarity can arise. The more you chase resolution from someone who is incapable of emotional responsibility, the more you abandon yourself in the process. You try to awaken them, but they are committed to sleep. You try to reason with them, but they are ruled by defense, not depth. You try to show them their own shadow, but they call it yours. So your work is not to make them see, it is to see yourself. To recognize the pattern you've been pulled into. To name the pain clearly and then step away, not in bitterness, but in self-respect. Because real healing begins the moment you stop expecting emotional maturity from someone who is emotionally undeveloped. Forgiveness in this context is not reconciliation. It's not even something you do for them. It's a quiet act of self-preservation. You forgive by refusing to carry the confusion they left behind. You forgive by no longer looking back, waiting for them to admit what they have spent their life avoiding. You forgive by choosing peace over proof.